All right, today we're tackling a massive, world-changing story, the rise of Islam. Now, this is a story that's usually told in a very specific way, but what if I told you there's another way to look at it? In fact, there are at least two very different histories here. And getting to grips with that difference, well, that's key to understanding how history itself works.
So, how is history written? The story of Islam's beginnings is often this incredible, powerful narrative of faith and divine revelation. And it is. But like any history, right, it's a story with more than one angle, especially when you start looking at it through the eyes of a modern historian.
So we're basically looking through two different lenses here. First, you've got the tradition-based account. This comes from these amazing literary sources that were written by Muslims for Muslims centuries after the fact. Then you've got the modern academic take. This one casts a much wider net, It pulls in things like archaeology and non-Muslim accounts to piece together a different, maybe more complex picture of how things developed. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll break down these two views of history. Then we'll dive into that traditional narrative. After that, we'll switch gears and look at things from a different perspective, asking the kinds of questions a historian would ask. We'll look at the sources and wrap it all up by thinking about history as a conversation. All right, Section 1. Two views of history, a faith narrative and an academic inquiry. Let's get right into it. And look, the key here isn't about deciding who's right or wrong. It's more about understanding that these two approaches are trying to do very different things.
And this is the absolute core of it. The traditional account is really focused on the meaning of it all, the divine guidance behind these events, what they mean for believers. Academic scholarship, on the other hand, zooms in on the historical process. It treats Islam's rise as a complex human story, something that grew and changed over time, just like other major civilizations.
Okay, let's get into the traditional narrative, the story of a prophet and a people. This is the foundational story, the one that's absolutely central to the faith and has shaped a global community for centuries. It's a powerful one.
So the traditional story follows a pretty clear timeline. It all starts around 570 AD with the birth of Muhammad and Mecca. Then, around 610, he starts receiving revelations. The huge turning point is in 622, the Hijra, when he and his followers moved to Medina and set up the very first Muslim community. After Muhammad's death in 632, his successors, the caliphs, take over and expand the state. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. This period also saw the rise of powerful dynasties, like the Umayyads and then the Abbasids, and a whole lot of internal conflict.
Let's zoom in on that one event, the Hijra in 622 AD. This is so much more than just a move from one city to another. It's the moment a small group of followers becomes a real community, a state, a society. I mean, it's so important that it's literally year one on the Islamic calendar. It's the shift from being a persecuted minority to becoming a force to be reckoned with. But that early unity, it didn't last. After the third caliph, Uthman, was killed, the whole community was thrown into its first major civil war, the Fitna. And this was a massive shock to the system. I mean, this wasn't just about politics. It forced everyone to ask these huge, soul-searching questions. Who should lead us? What does justice look like? What does it mean to be a good Muslim? And those questions, they're still echoing today. And right out of that conflict, you get the biggest split in Islam. It all came down to one question: who should lead? This is what gave rise to Sunni and Shiite Islam. For Sunnis, the idea was that the leader should be chosen from the Prophet's tribe, and authority rests with the community's scholars. But for Shiites, it was completely different. They believed leadership had to stay within the Prophet's family, with a divinely appointed imam who had special knowledge. So fast forward a bit. The traditional view is that by the 9th century, under the Abbasid Caliphate, things really got locked in. All the course stuff, the legal schools, the theology, the collections of the Prophet's sayings, it all gets written down and established. The Islam we know today really takes shape. Okay, time to shift gears. Let's look at a different perspective, the one where historians start asking some different questions. Because for a historian, it's not enough to ask, what happened? The real question, the one that changes everything, is how do we know what happened? And this quote right here from C.H. Becker really gets to the heart of the academic argument. The idea is, what if Islam didn't just pop up, fully formed, in the middle of Arabia? What if it actually took shape outside of Arabia as the Arab conquerors interacted with these older, super sophisticated cultures of the Byzantine and Persian empires? It's a game-changing thought. Right, so this perspective asks us to totally rethink time and place. We have to zoom out, way out, both in terms of the timeline and the map. Instead of seeing Islam's origin as this isolated event, we start to see it as part of a much bigger story, the story of late antiquity. And this chart just lays it out so clearly. The traditional view sees this incredibly fast formation, right? Maybe 20 or 30 years, all happening in Arabia. The academic view, it stretches that timeline way out. We're talking 200 years or more. And it's not just happening in Arabia. It's happening all across the Middle East, across this huge, sprawling empire.
So it's not a story of a complete break from the past. It's actually a story of continuity. Historians argue that early Islamic civilization didn't just wipe the slate clean. No way. It was an heir to this incredible world of late antiquity. It took the administrative tricks, the legal ideas, the cultural practices of the Byzantines and Persians, and adapted them, making them part of something new.
Which brings us to the really tricky part for historians. This is where the detective work really kicks in, questioning the sources.
Okay, so here's a mind-blowing fact that's absolutely crucial for the academic view. The earliest detailed Muslim books we have about Islam's origins, the biographies, the histories, they weren't written until around 880. That's almost 150 years after the events they're talking about. So, as a historian, you have to ask, are these books a perfect window into the 7th century, or are they telling us more about the world of the people who wrote them in the 9th century?
Let's take the Hadith, for example. These are the reports about what the Prophet said and did, and they're a huge source for Islamic law. The way they were traditionally authenticated is pretty amazing. You have the text of the report, the matn, and then you have the isnad, which is the chain of people who supposedly passed it down. If that chain was strong and all the people in it were trustworthy, boom, the report was considered authentic.
But then, scholars like Ignaz Goldziher and Joseph Schacht came along and threw a wrench in the works. They asked a really provocative question. What if a lot of these hadith, and even their chains of transmission, were actually created much later? They argued that as political and legal debates were raging in the 8th and 9th centuries, people might have invented sayings and attributed them to the Prophet to make their own side of the argument sound more legitimate. A pretty radical idea.
So, if the Muslim literary sources are complicated for a historian, where else can they look? What other evidence is there from that early period?
Well, they pull out a totally different toolkit. They start looking at non-Muslim accounts. What did Christians, Jews, or Zoroastrians write at the time? They dig into archaeology. They look at things like early coins and official papyri. Even inscriptions, like the one on the Dome of the Rock, give us a little snapshot of what was going on. All these little pieces help build a different kind of picture. Okay, let's bring this all together. History as a conversation, 2 narratives, 1 past. The big takeaway here isn't that you have to pick a side. The point is to see that we have 2 really powerful but really different ways of looking at the exact same moment in time.
Because in the end, having these 2 narratives, one that focuses on the deep meaning of the past and another that's obsessed with how we know about the past, it doesn't mean one has to be wrong. It just shows us that history isn't some dusty old book of facts. It's a living, breathing, ongoing conversation about where we came from. And that conversation is never really over.